UFOs have always been a fringe subject, ridiculed and ignored whenever possible by the establishment culture, but change is in the wind. UFOs are suddenly being discussed in the mainstream culture without the goofy X-Files music in the background, without the jokes. And I would say expect that change to continue. Where it leads us is a very important consideration. When I look at the state of UFO research or ufology during 2019, I see a community in upheaval. And I think it's pretty much agreed by anyone who's been paying attention that this is actually the case. The serious level of attention being paid to this subject by the establishment media, quite frankly, I don't think it's anything that anyone could have predicted more than 2 years ago. I truly don't believe there's a single person out there who saw this coming. Most of this, not all, but most, has been driven by the people in the To the Stars Academy, TTSA. No question they have been driving some sort of process, some sort of disclosure process forward over the past 2 years, and it has really picked up some steam since this spring. And even if all of this was in order to promote their brand or their TV show Unidentified, if it's all just in order for them to make some money, the fact is that they're still pushing forward a UFO message that is getting out to the establishment, to the mainstream media. And it's getting out in a way that no one has been able to do in generations. So say what you want about whether or not you trust their motives, as if everyone is some sort of mind reader who can figure all this out, no problem. They are genuinely getting the United States and the rest of the world to talk about UFOs without the giggle factor. And how many UFO organizations or researchers can claim that? Now, all of this, all that's come out over the last 2 years, and it's caused a lot of people to get excited that a genuine disclosure of the truth about UFOs is on the way. It's caused other people basically to proclaim that these guys are false prophets, that it's a false flag designed to scare the public. As always happens in our society these days, you see a lot of people reacting rather than reflecting. And I really think it's harder these days for people to quietly reflect on something for any extended period of time before they make up their minds on pretty much anything. We're way beyond the age of instant gratification. That's so 1990s. Now it's the age of instant engagement, in which all reactions on social media are readily scalable to reach thousands of people within any given community. It actually may be impossible to expect civil discourse or rational thinking any longer in a society that is this type of dynamic in play. It's as though the slightest movement of the control knob causes the needle to go haywire. And you see this well beyond our community of people interested in UFOs, of course. This is everywhere. Twitter mobs, Facebook mobs, YouTube mobs, Instagram mobs. It's probably a good idea to divest yourself of a lot of that just in order to maintain your own sanity. I really believe that. But this is how we communicate nowadays, so I suppose we need to find a way to do it in a way that works. I'm just not sure that we'll be able to do that without the constant sense of outrage, overreaction, sense of indignation that we seem to live with every single day online. Who actually likes to live like that? I think this unfortunate development in our society has been the biggest reason that every year, it seems, there's some new apocalypse, some new crisis to hit ufology. Every year there's someone out there breathlessly talking about how this is the end of ufology, or that's the end of responsible research, or this is the end of fill in the blank. It's simply because certain people have learned that the more extreme they can be in their public statements, the more attention they're going to get. This degrades the quality of our public conversation, and there is no way that I see how to change that without affecting freedom of speech, and I will never support infringing freedom of speech. There's too much of that going on as it is. So back to our current upheavals in ufology. Aside from the histrionics that you hear from some quarters, there is a genuine reason for our heads to be swimming right now. Even though this isn't the first time ufology has been through the rodeo of disclosure, or the disclosure rodeo. In every decade following the Second World War, there have been moments when Some people thought that UFO secrecy might be on the verge of ending. During the 1950s, we're talking almost 70 years ago, there were people then who had their finger on the pulse of the situation, and they thought that the UFO secret might actually be revealed. That's way back in 1952, when flying saucers were being reported across the United States, and they were being taken seriously by many serious individuals. But still, disclosure did not happen. During the 1960s, there was an upsurge in sightings, and once again, this led to a lot of media coverage on UFOs. There were congressional hearings on UFOs. There was a lot of talk about how the Air Force wasn't being honest about UFOs. That led to the Air Force, rather brilliantly, I'd say, to announce that they were going to pay a university to do a scientific study of UFOs, all back in the 1960s, and that they were going to be guided by the recommendations of this university. This, of course, was the infamous Condon Committee out of the University of Colorado at Boulder. We know the story of that one. Many people at the time thought, wonderful, a genuine scientific study of this phenomenon. Maybe it'll lead to something good. Except that the game was rigged from the beginning. There was no genuine science in this so-called scientific study. It was a smart exercise in propaganda that allowed the Air Force to close Project Blue Book in 1969, and that's really all it was. But hopes for disclosure didn't end there. During the 1970s, the Freedom of Information Act came into really its useful phase, and it became useful for people researching UFOs, to the shock of many people at the time. Thousands of pages of previously classified memos and reports and documents were released through FOIA on UFOs. And once again, there was a cause for hope. After all, mixed in with some pretty uninteresting reports and documents that were, not all that interesting, were several that were absolutely interesting. Reports of objects engaging in, or at least snooping around sensitive military locations that did things that were considered to be impossible. And no one could figure out who was possibly able to make these things. We're talking all about these amazing capabilities of the 2004 Tic Tac UFO being recorded back in the 1940s and 1950s. So we're talking about objects being reported as moving in the multiple thousands of miles per hour. Objects back in the 40s and 50s with incredible maneuverabilities and so on. It seemed to the people getting these reports for the first time back in the 70s, getting these reports through Freedom of Information, that this could well lead to a breakthrough in the media and that it could get the attention that UFOs deserved. I mean, after all, this was proof in black and white, in documents, of real UFOs being encountered by the U.S. military, basically leaving them in the dust. That's important. So yes, people had hope in the 70s, but the reaction from the mainstream media back then was, the sound of silence. There was essentially no reaction. And once again, hope was raised and the hopes were dashed. So in the 50s, hopes were raised and they fell. In the 60s, in the 70s, and in the 80s and 90s as well. There were many dedicated UFO researchers who never gave up on the idea that somehow a breakthrough could occur. I began researching UFOs during the early 90s. I became pretty obsessed early on. I fully admit that. I saw the evidence of the reality of the phenomenon. I saw the evidence of a significant cover-up. I thought, I'd like to put together a reliable history of all this and do my own part toward ending the cover-up. I wrote several very long books on the subject. Other researchers came along at the same time, and they have been putting out tremendous amounts of information. There have been disclosure conferences, many of them. There have been White House petitions. There have been countless attempts to engage the establishment media with this subject. And by and large, all attempts have failed. And then, starting in 2017, something changed. TTSA announces their formation. 2 months later, they are clearly involved in a major way with the articles in Politico and the New York Times. And suddenly, the establishment media is telling the rest of us that maybe some UFOs are real, and some UFOs are significant, and that they even have defense significance. To me, when that happened in 2017 in December with those articles, it was an amazing thing. Now, I realize to many of us who've studied this matter for years and years, a lot of those admissions are pretty tepid, pretty lukewarm. And compared to what the full reality is likely to be about UFOs, I certainly agree. I've been saying for some time that this version of UFOs that TTSA is promoting, at least until very recently, most of it's been drained of nearly all of its history, drained of 70 years of sightings and cover-up and additional context. But keep some perspective on this. You would have to go back to the 1950s or maybe the 1960s to find a significant portion of the establishment media being willing to take this subject seriously. That many years. So the question we're asking is, what next? Where is this going? Will this lead to yet another disappointment and rollback? We have to ask this question because, in fact, that's been the historical pattern. My sense of the situation, which I've held for at least the last year, is that TTSA is a faction. They're not the CIA, they're not the intelligence community, they're a faction. They are a certain group of individuals with connections to the classified world, and they have a disclosure agenda, or we might say a partial disclosure agenda. Now, why they have that agenda is something we can speculate about and we can talk about, but I'd be very careful before saying that I know or that anyone else actually knows what their agenda is. Motives aren't always simple, and the people in that group might have different motives anyway from each other. But whatever their motives, the information is coming out. There's now more information on the details of the incredible 2004 Tic Tac UFO event than we ever realized or ever thought that we would be able to get. And ditto on the 2014-2015 incursions relating to the USS Roosevelt Battle Group on the U.S. Eastern Coast. We're learning from also from individuals within TTSA, people like Luis Elizondo, that there have been genuine UFO crash retrievals. This is something he told Tucker Carlson not long ago before the whole world. So there's more and more toothpaste coming out of the tube. And TTSA isn't the whole story either. The leaks of at least some of the papers of the late Apollo astronaut, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, are going to continue to have an impact, and that impact is only going to grow. The case is overwhelming that at deep, deep levels of secrecy, defense contractors have in their possession alien technology, and they are doing everything possible to try to understand it and to replicate it. Serious researchers have known this for a long time, of course, but this information now has the backing of very powerful documentation, and it will not go away. It's going to remain in our field, in our world, and it will make it to a wider audience. From my perspective, the dam is showing signs of breaking. Where that's going to lead in the aftermath brings a whole new set of questions. A decade ago, I co-authored a book asking those very questions. I wonder now if I'll be in the lucky position to be able to check the accuracy of the predictions I helped to make back then. But the real thing to keep in mind is that we're living in a highly unstable situation. It seems that history is speeding up. And the only thing we can count on is that tomorrow is not going to look like today. I don't expect a full or honest disclosure of UFOs this year or next year or even the years after that. Not full and honest. But I do expect that there will be a continued crescendo that is going to be harder and harder for the rigid, ideologically driven skeptics to dismiss. They'll continue to dismiss them because they're ideologically driven, but their mental gymnastics are going to be increasingly obvious to the rest of us. And at some point, we will reach the tipping point when enough information has been officially recognized that it develops its own momentum. I wish our society weren't like that. I wish we didn't rely on permission from our established structures to tell us when it's okay to believe in something. But in practice, that's kind of how our world is. It's absolutely messed up for sure. but it's not hard to see that this is how it works. The good news is that pressure from below still works. Pressure from society still exists. And eventually the establishment will be forced to acknowledge new truths. Why? Because it happens all the time. And I believe it will not be long before we see it happening with that subject, which for years and years has been the most fringe of all, UFOs. Thanks for watching. If you like what you see, please click the like button, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and click to receive notifications. All that really helps me. And do see what Tracy and I are up to on our website, richarddolanmembers.com.